It looks like this video is semi-topical, because in the last couple of hours, Formula 1 has announced that the Belgian Grand Prix will remain on the calendar until 2031, albeit with a couple of stars next to that. The article posted by Formula 1's press office was a way of making bad news into good news. While from the initial reading of the headline it appears the track will be on the calendar until 2031, you won't actually see a race there every single year. Because of this rotation thing that Formula 1 wants to do, one of the most popular and one of the 4 most historic tracks in Formula 1 won't be seen in 2028 or 2030. One of the 3 tracks, along with Silverstone and Monza, that shouldn't go into rotation, is now on rotation. Bother, in French, which I think is mad. So with that acknowledged, I thought I would talk about something that I've been meaning to talk about for a long time. Another Michael Schumacher wet weather masterclass, the 1997 Belgian Grand Prix. Michael Schumacher in the 1990s was very well supported. The guy ended up having 4 or 5 home races a year in some cases. The 2 races at the Nürburgring and Hockenheim, the 2 Italian races in Monza and Imola because, he's the hero of the Tifosi, and to a lesser extent, the Belgian Grand Prix. That being because it was where he made his Formula 1 debut for Jordan in 1991, then got his first win in 1992, and over the next 15 years or so made it one of his happy hunting grounds, winning 6 times there in his career. 1 more than Senna and Hamilton, and 2 more than Clark and Raikkonen. And Jim Clark's wins were kind of against the grain, for want of a better phrase. He hated that place, back when it was the 8-mile MASH triangle, but he somehow won there 4 times in a row. Probably because he wanted to get it all out of the way, and the 1963 race there is one of the all-time classics. The only other driver to win 4 in a row at Spa? Senna. Has to be said that if not for the 1994 disqualification from that year's Belgian Grand Prix because of his plank, Michael would have had 7 wins at Spa, which would have been a mad statistic. But even then, 6 is still a brilliant statistic. 9 wins at Silverstone, or 6 at Spa. I think most people are going to take the 6 at Spa. But anyway, the Belgian Grand Prix became the 5th home race, simply because the German Schumacher fans would rush over the border into Belgium from the area around Dusseldorf, Cologne and a bit further east from Frankfurt, and then set up camp in the Ardennes. Do not mention the war. And this year was no exception, because Schumacher had won the previous year's Belgian Grand Prix, with Ferrari outsmarting Williams on pit stop strategy in such a way that Williams utterly dropped the ball, and that in itself will have to be a future video. The Michael being up near the top of the driver's standings in 1997 had resulted in the German in his Scarlet machine that mirrored the legendary Manfred von Richthofen generating a lot of interest. And when I say up near the top, he was actually leading the driver's standings at this time. Schumacher was ahead of the Williams of Jacques Villeneuve by 3 points as they headed into this round after the absolutely insane Hungarian Grand Prix. Villeneuve had won that race, if not for some divine intervention, and had the race been 1 lap shorter, it would have been an arrows on the top step of the podium, but it is what it is. And I have to keep mentioning this because I need you to share my sadness. In 3rd, Jean Alesi in the Benetton was just ahead of teammate Gerhard Berger, who had won the German Grand Prix, with Villeneuve's teammate Frentzen down in 5th. Irvine was 6th, Panis 7th, although he was missing this race due to having broken his legs in Canada, which is another video for the future, and Coulthard, Hakkinen and Herbert rounded out the top 10. Mika and DC showing how awfully unreliable the McLaren was that year. You wouldn't know Coulthard had won a race already that season with that points tally. But just to illustrate things a tiny bit better, the Spa circuit in 1997 was, well, a little bit different to how it is now. Not massively different, but just a little bit different. If you're a newer motorsport fan, you might wonder why the commentators refer to the final chicane at Spa as the bus stop, when it doesn't resemble a bus stop at all. That's because in 2006, the Belgian Grand Prix was off the calendar because they were making major upgrades to the circuit, with some of those upgrades involving moving the start-finish straight back a tiny bit, then moving La Source a bit further up, and then installing a new chicane to help overtaking and also make the new start-finish straight as long as they could possibly make it. In 1997, that final section looks something like this. Now you realise why it's called the bus stop chicane, because here it actually looks like a bus stop. And over the years, the pit entry had changed, but in 1997, the pit lane entry saw the driver shoot up the escape road, cutting the chicane out entirely, and then arrived in the pit lane, while the starting grid went around that final left-hand kink that led onto the very short start-finish straight before they then hit the brakes full of sauce once again. and a good chunk of the track was still public road at this time. Between Stavelot and Les Combes it was public road, while the rest of it was purpose-built racetrack. Friday saw the rain come down, and it saw the two Benettons go fastest. But the following day, on the Saturday, the morning session was still a bit wet, but for the second session before qualifying, it was bone dry. So it meant that nobody had really got the setups right, and nobody really had any time to do any long running to see what the setup would do to the tyres over the course of the Grand Prix. At this time, the teams had to declare which tyres they were going to run. As explained before, this showed two strategies. Hards lasted longer but were slower, while softs were faster but might need the teams to save a bit or have the extra stop. On top of this, Goodyear's hard tyre was equivalent to Bridgestone's soft tyre, meaning that Bridgestone had an advantage on high wear or very hot tracks, as they had done at Hungary, Brazil, Argentina, and later on at the A1 ring, or Red Bull ring as it is now. A1 is or was a telecoms company, apparently. Pretty much all the teams went for the hard tyre in the end, while Arrows and Minardi decided to take the softer compound Bridgestones. But it was all just guesswork at this point, and whoever could adapt best would certainly be in for a better time, while those who chose to constantly faff about with the setups are going to be wasting time and paying for that decision later on. It was better to get a setup and work out how to make the best of what they'd got, rather than find time rushing the perfect setup in the limited time that they'd got. They had just 45 minutes of dry running before qualifying, so the grid was likely to be messed up. And it was, a little bit at least. Villeneuve stuck his Williams on pole by 3/10 while Jean Alesi put his car alongside. In third was Schumacher, 8/10 off the pace, with Fisichella putting his Jordan in fourth. The rest of the top 10 was Hakkinen, Ralph, Frentzen, Diniz, Hill and Coulthard, while Eddie Irvine was down in 15th and 3 seconds off Villeneuve's time. Eddie and Heinz Harald had both endured a tough session, with Frentzen going off at Les Combes and hitting a wall which required him to do his final qualifying run in the spare car, a spare car which was set up for Villeneuve and he just could not get along with it. Irvine blamed Ralph for forcing him off the road, resulting in his poor qualifying performance. Maybe Eddie spent too much time fiddling with setup rather than setting laps in that session, but I don't know. And Berger also hit a wall in qualifying and had to use the spare car. Hakkinen, meanwhile, had by far the biggest moment in the session when his suspension failed going into Les Combes and he smacked into the barriers. The suspension part in question was made of composite materials, and McLaren had to hurriedly replace the suspension on Coulthard's car and the spare car, replacing those parts with metal parts to make sure that they got through the race safely. Despite this, Hakkinen was in 5th, but was racing under appeal because the fuel he was using in qualifying didn't match the sample that was given to the FIA after practice. Sunday looked to be dry again, and it looked like it would be dry for the race. But in the Ferrari camp, Schumacher was looking glum despite starting in 3rd. Compared to Friday, Sunday was hot and sunny, and Schumacher had ended the warm-up session down in 15th. For those that aren't familiar with the rules of the time, back then they had about half an hour or so of warm-up so the cars could go out on race fuel and tweak the setups for race running prior to the start of the Grand Prix. The richer teams would use the opportunity to stick in a race-specific engine or do some other bits and pieces, because that's what they did at the time. Some of the teams had an engine for every session. But after the warm-up, and with about an hour to go before Murray Walker screamed "Go, go, go" at us, it rained, and it absolutely bucketed it down. When Ralf Schumacher went out to drive round to the grid so they could get the car set up for the race, he actually crashed, and in the confusion, Eddie Jordan didn't know about it until he was told by, I think it was ITV. It was utterly horrendous. Puddles of water were everywhere, and though the whole track wasn't soaked, the vast majority of it was soaked. The weather in the Ardennes can be very unpredictable, and much like at Hockenheim, the weather just hung around in the trees. So when it rained, it just became miserable. At the same time, the Michael was taking exploration laps to the extreme, going out and running a lap in his regular Ferrari before returning to the pits, getting out, then getting into the spare car, and going round again. The spare car is known as Chassis 179, the second last car that Ferrari built over the course of 1997. It was lighter than the standard Ferrari 310B but had a larger fuel tank, and Schumacher had briefly used this car at the Hungaroring, but the demolition job the heat and the track were doing on the Goodyear tyres made him stick with the heavier car for that race weekend, and Chassis 179 was taken to the Belgian Grand Prix as well. While in the wet practice sessions at Spa, Schumacher had taken 179 out again, but couldn't find the right setup and wasn't feeling comfortable, so once again he stuck with the older, heavier and I guess more faithful Ferrari. For the race, it was going to be a toss-up between the two cars. Schumacher could have easily used 179 if the race was going to be dry because it had been set up for dry conditions, But because of the exploration laps he'd been doing, he had decided, once again, to use the regular car that had been outfitted with a setup that was going to be better in the changing conditions. And while on the grid, he made the last minute decision, along with Fisichella, to fit intermediates to the car. Jordan, Ferrari and some of the other teams took the gamble thinking that the rain shower was exactly that. Just the one shower and it had passed and the rest of the Grand Prix was going to be dry. At least there wasn't going to be any more rain arriving. And then a few minutes later they were given some good news that was going to help them out massively. The race was going to start behind the safety car. And the rules allowed for this. The 1997 sporting regulations written by the FIA allowed, in extreme circumstances, the ability for the race director to start the race behind the safety car. This was because of the deluge that had recently arrived and then passed. The rain had mostly fallen around the pit lane and up through to Les Combes, while the rest of the track had received a little bit less of a soaking. The drivers had lobbied for a safety car start at the Brazilian and Spanish Grand Prix in 1996, which were equally as wet. But in true FIA style, the teams were not told about the safety car until 5 minutes before the formation lap was due to start, meaning that some of the teams, including Benetton, Sauber and Williams, could not make the changes they wanted to the car because the 5-minute boards had been shown, and after they've been shown, you can't touch the cars anymore. Sauber couldn't tell Herbert and Morbidelli because the radios had broken. Villeneuve had been telling his team to put the intermediates on, but Williams wanted to avoid a repeat of Monaco where they put the intermediates on when the wets were the right option. With the air temperature now at a nice and warm 28 degrees Celsius or 82 Fahrenheit in old money, it was the weirdest thing ever. It was sunny, it was hot, so why was there all this water on the track? And with the safety car driving round, it meant that nobody could overtake and the cars could move some of that standing water themselves, while the sun did the heavy lifting. But once again, in true FIA fashion, nobody knew what was going on. Because they were being so soft and starting behind the safety car and not driving like the good old days of the 90s when they could actually race in the wet, there was some confusion about how this was actually supposed to work. Oliver Gavin, driving the safety car, led the field away as they formed up in a 22-car long snake. Villeneuve, Alesi, Michael, Fisi, Hakkinen, Frentzen, Diniz, Hill, Coulthard, Herbert, Barrichello, Morbidelli, Berger, Nakano, Irvine, Magnussen, Salo, Katayama, Verstappen, Marquez, Ralph and Trulli. The latter two starting from the pit lane, but Trulli never got going. The rules were that the safety car led the snake round, and as soon as Villeneuve crossed the line after what would have been the formation lap, the race officially started. But none of the marshals seemed to realise this, as they were holding out the boards telling the cars where they had to stop on the grid, and they were wondering why they just kept on driving round. So when Villeneuve crossed the line while moving, the race had officially started lap 1. The next person to be caught out by the rules was Hakkinen. He hit some standing water and went off, losing 2 places. When he took them back, he found himself in trouble with the FIA. As the Michael found out at the British Grand Prix in 1994, overtaking on the formation lap is illegal unless you have a valid reason to do so. The problem for Mika was that even with that formation lap before they crossed the line and the race officially began, nobody was quite aware of whether this was your standard safety car period or if it counted like a formation lap would, with Hakkinen having a valid reason to take his position back in the train. Due to the exceptional circumstances of what was going on, the FIA hit Mika with a reprimand. And then a suspended 1-race ban because, why not? McLaren were just racking it up at this point. For starters, they'd got this appeal that was going on for the fuel irregularity, and they were likely to be hit with more fines because they were basically just wasting the FIA's time by appealing when they had no leg to stand on. As well as this, there was the suspension problem that had affected Hakkinen in qualifying, so it was just piling on the team at this point. And these days, it's easy to tell who is using which tyre. Pirelli has the coloured logos on the sidewalls, so it's easy to see who has what. Red is soft, yellow is medium, white is hard, green is intermediate, and blue is the full wet, with Pirelli having like sub-compounds within those compounds, if you follow me. In those days, it was a bit trickier to see who had what because Goodyear had 3 wet tyres to choose from. There was the 1996 wet tyre called the Quattro, the 1997 spec wets that had a V cut in them, and then the intermediates, which weren't too dissimilar to the intermediates that you see today. Villeneuve, Alesi, Berger, Frentzen, Irvine and Ralph were all on the Quattros, apparently. As for the Bridgestone guys, they didn't factor into this race at all, really, because the rain had negated any hot weather advantage that they might otherwise have had. For 3 official laps plus the initial getaway lap, the safety car led the cars around before releasing them. Had the race started normally, Villeneuve and Alesi would have been off into the distance, but because the track had indeed dried out while they spent 10 or 12 minutes behind the safety car, they'd lost their advantage. And behind them, Schumacher was ready to pounce. It wasn't an instant overtake though. Villeneuve and Alesi were able to hold position on the first proper racing lap, but on the second proper racing lap, Schumacher overtook Alesi into La Source and then managed to get Villeneuve into Rivage. And Alesi, as he turned in, saw Schumacher dive bomb at the last second and had to pull out of the way. The difference between the intermediates and the wets by this point was evident. Schumacher was out of sight by the time they reached Fagnes, and Fisichella was harrying Alesi and Villeneuve. The rooster tails being flung up by the cars was more evident between Stavelot and the bus stop, but everywhere else it was drying out quite nicely. Fisichella got past Alesi into Les Combes at the start of lap 6 and then went after Villeneuve, with the Jordan's pace advantage immense in the brighter areas of the track from Les Combes up to Pouhon. But in 2 laps, Alesi and Villeneuve holding everybody up had allowed Schumacher to get a 6 to 8 second advantage. Villeneuve's day was about to get worse though, because his wet tyres were basically melting as the track was drying out. He went into the bus stop and completely missed the corner, so he had to pull an audible and come in to get his tyres changed, going on to the intermediates that he wanted at the start of the Grand Prix. The problem was, on the very next lap, Alesi had come in. For slicks. Patrick Head was quoted on racefans.net as saying that JV was more of a ritual driver than anything else. While Schumacher had a more technical brain that could analyse the current situation and make calls in the moment based off what was going on, Villeneuve needed his quiet time before getting going. Often, he'd sit in the car in silence as he got into the zone, and the team would ask him questions that would sometimes get no answer. A lazy switch kind of made his starts on the wet seem like less of a bad decision, while JV had to come in again to get rid of his intermediates that were now about to be lobbed into the bin after just 5 laps. But Schumacher got it so right while everybody else got it so wrong. At the start of his 10th lap in the lead, he was nearly a minute ahead of second place. And then he just started cruising. It was like, do I need tyres? Probably not, but I've got the cushion. He didn't bother for the rest of the race. 22 seconds was the gap at the end. After suffering so hard in the warm-up, the rain was a blessing in disguise as it, along with Williams and Villeneuve dropping the ball so hard, allowed Michael to gain another 9 points in the championship, as Villeneuve had to charge his way back from 15th up to 6th. But in second place, having an incredible race after he too gambled on tyres, was Fisichella. While he had technically taken a wet tyre while Michael had taken the intermediate, Fizzy was on the 1997 wet tyre, which was faster than the 1996 one, and was able to largely outpace Häkkinen, who had a faster McLaren. Although Häkkinen was disqualified for the fuel infringement, which allowed Frentzen up into 3rd, Herbert 4th, Villeneuve 5th, which dropped Schumacher's points advantage to 8 for the race, and then Berger in 6th. Diniz, Alesi, Morbidelli and Irvine filled out the top 10. Alesi had been doing well, but a series of pit stops after he had problems with the plank knocked him back a bit. In terms of the points, Michael was now the favourite for the title. Williams had dropped it hard, and if Ferrari had really turned a corner in development, then there was no reason why Michael shouldn't be able to win it. An 11-point lead could still easily be wiped out if Villeneuve was to win a race and the Ferrari didn't finish. And at the same time, there's that stat to remember of JV and the Michael never sharing a podium during 1997. And I think there was only one race in the whole season where neither of them ended up on the podium. It was just a mad season. And with Monza coming up, it meant that Ferrari would be in a position to try and outscore Williams further, especially with that home field advantage. But that 11-point lead would start to come down, starting from the Italian Grand Prix. But much like Monaco in 1997 and Spain the year before, it showed that even with a slightly inferior car, Schumacher was still the driver to beat in those kinds of conditions, simply because he could analyse the situation better than everybody else and make the calls as he needed them. But still, there was a lot to play for going into the next race. Like I said, 11 points could drop incredibly quickly. And they did. So then, a look at another Michael Schumacher masterclass in the wet that gets slept on. At least, I think it gets slept on. If this has been a fun look through the history books, then do give the video a like so I know I did a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed and get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.